Script: The woman who dug for King David's palace and found names from the Bible in the dirt. In the year 2005, an archaeologist stood at the edge of a hill in Jerusalem and did something almost no one in her field was willing to do. She opened a trench based on a single sentence from the Bible. Not because she was a believer looking for proof of Scripture, because she was a scientist who had a hunch that everyone else had been too afraid to test. What her team pulled out of the ground over the next several years would include walls thick enough to belong to a king, and clay seals stamped with the names of men who appear, word for word, in the book of Jeremiah. Her name was Eilat Mazar, and this is the true story of how she may have found the palace of King David, and why half the archaeological world still isn't sure whether to believe her. To understand why this discovery mattered so much, you first have to understand the woman who made it and the family she came from. Eilat Mazar was not an outsider who stumbled into biblical archaeology. She was born into it. Her grandfather was Benjamin Mazar, one of the most respected Israeli archaeologists of the 20th century, a scholar who led massive excavations around the base of the Temple Mount after 1967 and helped shape how modern researchers understood the ancient city. Growing up around him meant growing up around excavation sites, around pottery being sorted on folding tables, around adults arguing quietly over what a broken wall might mean. She once said, later in life, that she didn't choose archaeology so much as she was born into it. By the time she was old enough to study the subject formally at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, she already understood something most students take years to learn, that the ground rarely hands you a clean answer. You have to earn it layer by layer, argument by argument. She built her academic career the careful way, earning her doctorate in the 1990s with a dissertation focused on Jerusalem itself, not some quiet corner of the region, but the most argued-over city on earth. Colleagues who worked with her over the years describe her as meticulous almost to a fault, someone who treated every stone's exact position as data, who documented everything before she let herself speculate about anything. But she also had a habit that made some of her peers uncomfortable. She took the Hebrew Bible seriously as a historical source, not as scripture to be defended, but as a very old text that might, in places, preserve real geographic memory, descriptions written by people who had actually stood on that ground. By the late 20th century, this was an unfashionable position in her field. A powerful consensus had formed among many archaeologists that early Jerusalem, in the time period when the Bible places King David and King Solomon, was small and unimpressive, a modest hill town, not the capital of a kingdom. Under this view, sometimes called the low chronology or minimalist model, the grand biblical picture of a powerful united monarchy ruling from Jerusalem was seen as legend dressed up as history, and using the biblical text to decide where to dig was viewed as bad science, a shortcut for people who already knew what they wanted to find. Mazar disagreed, quietly and for years. She didn't think the absence of a discovery meant there was nothing to discover. She suspected the earliest layers of Jerusalem hadn't been properly reached yet, that they were buried under thousands of years of later construction, destruction, and rebuilding, and that no one had looked in the right place because no one had taken the old descriptions seriously enough to be guided by them. So she went back to the text. Specifically, she went back to a short account in the second book of Samuel describing King David's residence, and to a related passage about a later king going down from the palace to meet with officials. That word, down, became the hinge of her entire theory. If a king had to walk down from his house to reach a lower area of the city, then his house had to be sitting on higher ground than that lower area. On the ridge in Jerusalem, known as the City of David, there's only one obvious candidate for that higher ground. The crest at the northern end of the ridge, the highest point before the land slopes steeply down toward the older, lower city below. That ridge is not some remote desert site. It sits just outside the walls of Jerusalem's old city, in the middle of a crowded neighborhood called Silwan, where homes are built right up against the excavation boundaries and daily life goes on directly above trenches that reach back 3,000 years. It had already been excavated in pieces since the 1860s. British engineers had explored its water tunnels by candlelight in the 19th century. French and German expeditions had mapped its walls. Israeli archaeologists, including Kathleen Kenyon and Yigal Shiloh, had dug there extensively in the 20th century and found, among other things, a massive step stone structure built into the hillside, one of the largest Iron Age structures ever found in Israel, along with a room nearby that held 51 clay seal impressions and became known as the House of Bully. So the site was famous, heavily studied, and still deeply unresolved. Was there ever a royal building on that crest, above the step structure? Nobody had found one. Many assumed there was nothing left to find. Mazar proposed something that struck a lot of her colleagues as reckless. Dig exactly where the text pointed, on the crest above the step stone structure, in an area many believed was too damaged by later building to hold anything meaningful. She was warned, more than once, that she would spend years of work and reputation on a patch of ground that had probably already been picked clean by earlier digs and later construction. She listened to those warnings and moved forward anyway, funded in part by a conservative American think tank, a choice that drew its own share of criticism from people who worried about mixing ideology with archaeology. Whatever you think about the funding, the method itself was unusual for the field. Instead of letting convenience or prior finds decide where to dig, she let an ancient sentence decide it. The early seasons looked exactly like her critics predicted. The upper layers were a mess, churned up by centuries of later building, filled with debris from periods that had nothing to do with the era she was chasing. A less stubborn excavator might have called it quits. She kept going down, past the disturbed material, and as her team worked deeper, the picture began to change. They started uncovering large sections of walls, some sections between roughly 2 and 5 meters thick, built from massive dress stones, the kind of construction that takes real resources and real authority to produce, not the work of a farming village. She called this the large stone structure, and she argued it sat directly above and connected to the older stepped stone structure that Shiloh's team had found decades earlier, forming one large complex on the highest point of the ridge. Using pottery recovered from sealed layers underneath the walls, she dated the earliest phase of construction to somewhere in the 11th or 10th century BC, which lines up with the period the Bible assigns to David and the early years of the Israelite monarchy. A wall, no matter how large, is not proof of a king. Mazar knew that better than anyone, and this is where the story gets genuinely interesting because the ground didn't stop at stone. In 2005, one of her area supervisors, a researcher named Yov Farhi, was working near the edge of the site when he spotted something tiny catching the light in a crack between stones. A small lump of hardened clay, no bigger than a fingernail, with faint lettering pressed into its surface. In the ancient world, when someone rolled up a papyrus document and tied it shut, they would press a soft piece of clay over the knot and stamp it with a personal seal, creating a kind of tamper-proof signature. The papyrus itself almost never survives. But if the clay happened to be baked hard by fire or by simple heat over centuries, it could last for thousands of years, carrying one person's name across the gap of time. Archaeologists call these objects bully. That first bulla, once cleaned and red, turned out to bear an inscription reading, belonging to Jehokel, son of Shelemiah, son of Shovi. A name like that would mean very little to most people. To anyone who has read the book of Jeremiah, it means quite a lot, because a royal official named Jehokel, son of Shelemiah, is mentioned twice in that book, sent by King Zedekiah to speak with the prophet Jeremiah during the final, desperate years before Jerusalem fell to Babylon in 586 BC. Then, working in a similar area not far away, Mazar's team found a second bulla, belonging to Gedaliah, son of Pashur. Gedaliah, son of Pashur, also appears in Jeremiah as one of the officials who wanted the prophet thrown into a cistern for his unpopular warnings. Two names from two different bulli, found within meters of each other, both matching officials named in the same biblical chapter, both dated by the excavators to the same narrow window of time in the late 7th or early 6th century BC. Later seasons, including work in a section of the site called the Northern Tower, produced more than 100 additional bulli, and across her full excavation she and her team recovered close to 250 seals and seal fragments in total, suggesting this part of the city functioned for a long stretch of time as a royal administrative center, a place where government business was conducted and archived. None of this, by itself, proves that the walls above them were David's actual palace. That is the honest, complicated part of the story, and it's worth sitting with instead of glossing over. Mazar herself was careful in her published reports, laying out her stratigraphy and her pottery evidence, and inviting scrutiny rather than declaring victory. Other respected scholars, including the historian Nadav Naaman, found her identification persuasive and backed the idea that the large stone structure represented a genuine royal building from the era of David. But plenty of others pushed back hard. Some argued her pottery dating was too imprecise to pin the walls to the 10th century with any confidence, and that the structure could belong to a later period entirely. Some pointed out that a building being royal doesn't automatically mean it was David's specific residence, rather than a later king's expansion or a completely different structure altogether. Some critics went further and suggested she had gone into the dig already convinced of what she wanted to find, and had read the evidence to fit that conclusion. This is not a fringe disagreement. It sits at the center of one of the longest-running debates in biblical archaeology, and serious, credentialed researchers land on very different sides of it to this day. What makes Mazar's career worth telling, regardless of which side eventually wins that argument, is the method itself and the discipline she brought to it. She never claimed to have definitively identified David's palace with total certainty. She said the evidence was, in her judgment, most consistent with that conclusion, and she published everything: her stratigraphy, her pottery readings, her seal impressions, so that other scholars could examine her reasoning and challenge it if the evidence didn't hold up. That's not the behavior of someone chasing headlines. It's the behavior of someone willing to stake a career-long argument on a stubborn, patient reading of both a text and a hillside, in a field where being wrong is punished swiftly and publicly. She continued excavating in the city of David and later at the Ophel, the area just south of the Temple Mount, for years afterward, and in 2015 her team there uncovered another striking bulla, this one bearing an inscription many scholars read as belonging to Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah, a seal impression some described as the first of its kind connected to an Israelite or Judean king ever found in a controlled archaeological excavation rather than purchased on the antiquities market. That, too, sparked debate over its reading and significance, because in this field, almost nothing goes unchallenged. Eilat Mazar died in May of 2021, and the argument she spent decades building did not end with her. The walls she uncovered are still there on that crest above Silwan, and archaeologists still disagree about exactly what they were. Some maintain they represent the genuine remains of a royal building from the age of Israel's earliest kings. Others believe the evidence points to a somewhat later period. Others sit somewhere in between, convinced the site was royal and administrative in function without being fully convinced it belonged to David specifically. What almost no one disputes anymore is that the site was significant, that real government business, real record-keeping, real officials whose names appear in the Bible were operating out of that part of Jerusalem during the era the biblical text describes. That alone forced a stubborn field to take a second, harder look at a question it had largely considered settled. So this isn't a story about a hidden chamber or a secret confession whispered before someone's final breath. It's a quieter and, in some ways, more interesting story. A scientist who took an unfashionable idea seriously, tested it against the actual ground instead of against popular opinion, and pulled real names out of real clay in a place many of her peers had already written off as exhausted. Whether those walls truly belong to King David or to someone else entirely is still an open question, argued over in academic journals by people with far more expertise than any headline can capture. But the debate itself, the fact that this question remains alive and contested rather than closed, is largely because one patient, methodical archaeologist refused to accept that a hopeless-looking trench had nothing left to say. So here's the actual question worth sitting with. When careful, published, peer-reviewed evidence still can't settle something this old, What does that tell us about how confidently we should ever talk about the ancient past? Leave your take in the comments, and if you want a deeper dive into the bully debate or the awful excavations, let me know, and I'll put that together next.